Rudyard Griffiths here, the publisher of The Hub. Welcome to this, a special edition of Hub Dialogues. I'm stepping in for Sean Speer to have a conversation that's been really important to me as The Hub's publisher. It's about the future of news and journalism in Canada, the growing role that government has played over the last decade in funding news outlets. For the record, The Hub has chosen not to take government subsidies in any form, but we want to keep an open mind about this evolving area of public policy debate and conversation. So we're extremely fortunate to have on the program today Maxime Cohen. He's a Scale AI Chair of Retail and Operations Management at McGill University. He's an advisor on AI for a whole bunch of different important companies, including the big ones, Google AI, IBM Research, Microsoft, Oracle, and my accounting software, Waze. So, Maxime, thank you so much for coming on Hub Dialogues to talk about this in-depth study you've done, looking at the Online News Act, some of its underlying assumptions. And I want to get into you right off the bat, your core contention here that this act and the whole public policy architecture that was subsequently designed to subsidize news outlets through this legislation called C-18, you feel is based on a kind of misunderstood or misconstrued economic premise. So let's begin with that core economic argument that resides at the center of your paper.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So it's a very interesting topic, the Canadian Online News Act, Bill C-18. When I started really taking a deep dive into this act, first of all, I really was impressed by the fact it was designed with very good intentions, with legitimate objectives. And just to give a little bit of setting the stage, the act sets with three objectives. The first one is enhancing fairness in the Canadian digital news marketplace. Now, interestingly enough, the word of fairness is not easily defined in that context. In fact, in my own research, spent quite a bit of time studying the concept of fairness, and one of the conclusions is the fact that it's a very subjective concept. It depends who you ask and where you want to define fairness. The second objective of the act is to support press independence, very important one for a democratic society. And the third one is to promote diversity among news outlets. So again, very, very good, honorable type of objectives. Unfortunately, I spent quite a bit of time reviewing the act, and it had some unintended negative consequences. So in a way, the act contributed to reduced access to news on platform. When I started working on this paper, I asked a few people, what do they know about the Canadian Online News Act? And interestingly, like a lot of my friends told me, oh, that's the legislation where we don't have the opportunity to see news articles on Meta's platforms like Facebook and Instagram. So a lot of people started understanding the act through those negative unintended consequences, where Meta decided to respond to the act by blocking news content from its platforms. When I asked publishers, especially smaller publishers, what do they think about the act? They told me actually the act has distorted those news publishers' ability to use platforms for Meta, again, Facebook and Instagram, as a strategic complement to amplify their content by increasing their traffic to their website and increasing dollar advertising as well. So in practice, the act actually had a lot of very good objectives, but did not really had good consequences on our society, unfortunately, like I developed in the white paper just published.
Yeah, so let's go a little bit deeper into one thing that fascinates me as the publisher of the Hub, responsible for generating the revenues that allow our organization to produce original news journalism without government subsidies, is I think your accurate diagnosis that the challenge facing news industries simply is that other people, most notably the platforms, are simply a heck of a lot better at selling advertising. That they've developed very sophisticated mechanisms, they've aggregated large audiences, and they just do an amazing job. We use them extensively here at the Hub to promote our own content, to find, in our case, readers and viewers at very low cost and bring them back to us to engage with our content. what you wrote resonated with me to the extent to which the act leaves that fundamental issue unaddressed. Am I right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great summary. So basically, I start the white paper by explaining like the advertising, first of all, the news landscape in Canada, and the fact that definitely one of the biggest change in the last decade was this very strike decrease of online advertising revenue for legacy media. And the two reasons are very easy to understand. If you are an advertiser, you want to show ads to your products or services, you have several options on the market to show the ads. And in recent years, we have a very, very massive increase in terms of the competitive landscape and the number of options that you have to show your ads. And so it leads to more choices. And as you said very rightly, the fact that a lot of those digital platforms have very good capability in terms of showing the right ad to the right person at the right time. So you can really target specific audiences with specific advertising content. And that's very attractive for advertisers in order to get a good return on investment for their advertising dollars. Now, so this is a big problem. So you can identify the problem on the fact that legacy news publishers have a very strong declining advertising revenue. And this is due to the increased competition for digital advertisers, like you just talked about. Now, the problem is the Act tries to address a slightly different problem, which is a news pricing problem. It really tries to give a pricing to this news distribution, and it misunderstands the platform's role in news distribution. So rather than platforms benefiting from news content, it's actually, in my opinion, many times the publishers themselves, and specifically small publishers, who benefit from accessing the platforms as opposed to platforms benefiting for accessing the news. So there is a little bit of a mismatch between identifying the problem and the proposed solution.
Mm-hmm. Let's go a bit deeper on that because, a lot of the politics around the act and what it purportedly was said to solve by the then government and various ministers was, again, an issue of unfairness, that supposedly the news creation and generation by outlets, like the Hub, for example, was somehow unduly benefiting the platforms, presumably, I guess, in terms of attracting people to their apps, keeping them on those apps, allowing the platforms to sell other ads to those people. And I think, as you've documented, has been documented elsewhere, it's really hard to actually find any proof point that indeed is the case. And now, don't we, Maxime, have an interesting real-world experiment that one of the platforms, Meta, has left news. It has taken it off its apps in Canada. And we can now see what the impact of that is on Meta's traffic and on engagement on its platform. So unpack that for us, because I think these are some important and salient points.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I really like the fact that you brought this real-world experiment, which is really like a very good tool used by many economists and many other scholars when you have those type of natural experiments comparing before and after when you impose a big shock on the system. So here, the big shock on the system will be Meta's decision in reaction to the act to remove access to news on their platforms. And indeed, all the testimonies and all the evidence that I reviewed, that have been reviewed by many others as well, kind of showcases the fact that Meta does not have a high value, if any value at all, from having news on their own platforms. Basically, the argument is that many people who go on Facebook and Instagram, they don't go there to check the news. I ask a lot of my friends, what is the main goal of going to Facebook or Instagram? Typically, they want to follow their own friends, to see like some sort of life events, see some vacation pictures, to catch up with acquaintances, to follow some influencers about some trendy topics, but definitely news has not been one of the answers I received. Now, the argument is that Meta can potentially replace the news content on anyone's feed by alternative content, something more personal, something from the all personal network, and we won't see a decrease in engagement, in the time spent by users on the platform, and so on. And in some way, it shows that news doesn't have a positive monetary value for Meta. And therefore, it doesn't sound rational to ask Meta to pay for some content they don't place value into. And that's why it led to Meta's decision to remove news content. And as you said, what is very interesting, and now we have enough time to compare before and after, and we don't see like that it impacted the platform's engagement and activities.
Mm-hmm. Well, so what starts to worry me here, it seems like a series of kind of compounding failures when it comes to this legislation. One, it's failing to understand what is actually ailing the news industry, which is not its inability to have platforms pay for content that supposedly has great value when we know it doesn't have great value. It's the fact that the world has changed and there are much more efficient ways for individuals and customers and government itself to advertise and to connect with audiences and have audiences buy, purchase, or become informed about its services. So let's talk about the kind of third leg of some of your concerns about what's now happened under the Act, and that's the distortion of competition. So on top of all these other factors where the Act is either based on, I think, faulty reasoning or premises, or it's failing to address core causes and factors, it's now creating some distortion in the marketplace. Can you explain that to us?
Definitely. So this is an interesting point where the Act actually may have, again, some unintended consequences, and one of which being to distort competition among digital platforms. So there are two ways to understand it. So first of all, it's important to mention the fact that the Act only applies to two platforms, Google and Meta. So if you look at this decision first, it imposes a financial constraint on these two platforms, while other platforms are not subject to the relevant regulatory obligations. Now, the second point is other platforms, like other than Google and Meta, could be, for example, disincentivized from growing and innovating in Canada out of fear of becoming subject to the Act, right? Because the Act was designed by having some thresholds. So specifically, the platform must meet several business criteria in order to be under the Act. It needs to have a global revenue of more than $1 billion Canadian dollars in a calendar year. It must operate a social media service or search engine. And the third one, it must have an average of at least 20 million active users or unique visitors in Canada at a month level. Now, if you're a platform that does not reach those thresholds, and you know upfront that if you grow further in Canada, you're going to be at one point reaching the threshold, is going to give you an incentive to actually slow your growth in order to remain under the threshold and not be under the regulatory of the Act. And that definitely distorts competition, which is not a good practice in order to have a free market.
Mm-hmm. Could you explain to me why TikTok wasn't subject to the Act? They seem to meet a lot of the requirements that you've just listed. And I was always curious as to, was the Act in some ways written specifically for Google and Meta, and why were other social media platforms, for instance, example being TikTok, which has news on it, why are they left off?
Actually, TikTok is a very interesting example because, as I write in the white paper, TikTok is definitely like benefiting, or at least like there are some arguments that show that TikTok may benefit from having news content on the platform. Mm-hmm. In particular, TikTok launched several new features last year and the year before in 2023, where there is a collaboration with news publishers and news influencers to be exactly present on the TikTok platform. So TikTok and other platforms are not subject to the Act because they don't satisfy all three business criteria. The first one was to have at least a total global revenue of more than $1 billion in calendar year. Second one was to operate social media service or search engine, which this one is satisfied. And the third one was to have at least 20 million active users or unique visitors in Canada per month. So at the time of the act, I believe that TikTok did not satisfy all three criteria, and therefore it was not part of the act. But again, it's a little bit weird to come up with specific numbers that are experienced as thresholds, because it's definitely singled out only two platforms where it again distorts the entire competition in that market.
Right. And we'll see in a matter of months, supposedly funds will begin flowing from Google through a so-called media collective to news organizations across Canada. It'll be $100 million over the course of a 12-month period, indexed to inflation. So this is a not insignificant subsidy. I realize, Maxime, and I can tell in our conversation, I think you and I both share this. We are approaching this conversation in good faith. We have genuine and real concerns about the state and the health of media in Canada. Its importance to democracy, its importance to civic literacy. To step aside from the paper for a moment, if there was another way to go about supporting the media, if we thought that that was a public good, that warranted public support, what kind of mechanisms might we consider? I know that other governments around the world, for instance, have looked at different tax subsidy schemes, the ability of people to donate to the media, the ability to designate journalism, aspects of journalism, the production of original news, in a sense, as a charitable activity, which it is not in Canada right now. If you were just a blue sky for us a moment, as you went through this paper and writing it, you must have at times thought, well, if I were king for a day, how might I try to support media outside of a structure like C18? Does anything come to mind?
No, that's a fantastic question. It's perhaps a bit outside, my expertise as a business school professor, but I totally agree that if the government views traditional media as a public good and some pillar of our democracy, from an economics perspective, there are many well understood tools available. And you mentioned taxes, incentives, all those tools are very well understood, and they can be used to support public goods and influence consumer behavior. Actually, a good initiative, to talk a little bit about positives, from the government in Canada between 2020 and 2024, digital news subscriptions expenses received a tax credit for the amounts paid by individuals like you and I to qualified Canadian journalism organizations. So that's something that is in a right trajectory, in my opinion. So again, if the government's position is that traditional media needs to have a space in society, it should be very careful when it designs policies that consider this entire ecosystem and the revenue sources that support it. If one thing I learned by taking a deep dive into the Online News Act is the fact that regulating this ecosystem is extremely challenging. One needs to consider all the stakeholders, and a well-thought policy not only should consider every stakeholder's incentive and objective, but also needs to anticipate what are the possible responses to the policy and to make sure that those responses are also aligned with the right direction of the policy making regulation that is in place. And this is very challenging, unfortunately. It requires a lot of people to sit together to get a very thorough understanding of the problem.
Yeah, well, one of the challenges, we've experienced here at the Hub as a relatively new media startup is that a lot of the legislative and subsidy framework was constructed with legacy incumbent media organizations in mind. So it's not part of your paper and it's outside of the scope of C18, but the other very significant subsidy that media receives in Canada right now is a payroll subsidy. In the form of the employment of full-time news journalists. Well, if you're a large organization employing a lot of journalists because you're an incumbent and because you've been at it for decades, or in the case of the Globe and Mail, some 150 plus years, it's fantastic for them to collect what are, subsidies that add up to, now well over 30% of the the payroll costs of journalists earning up to $85,000 a year. You then add on C18 over that and the money that will flow, the calculation mechanism within that's been decided in terms of the regulations that rolled out after the passage of the act, again, gives an advantage to headcount. It gives an advantage to larger incumbent organizations. I know at business schools and as an economist, one's always kind of thinking about how to ensure renewal and change and dynamism within an industry. Does it concern you in Canada that we seem to have spent a lot of time propping up the larger legacy institutions, and maybe that there's less on deck here, less on tap, less thinking and concern for, well, how do you create the next generation of media businesses that will innovate in this challenging business and hopefully provide Canadians with those civic and public goods that the media has long offered and let's hope will continue to do so in many years in the future?
No, that's a very good question. So, and it indeed brings us back to the concept of fairness. What is fair in this digital news marketplace? And as one of the goals of the Act is definitely to support press independence and to make sure that there is diversity among news outlets. And as you said, local journalism and like small outlets, typically in those policies may be left out of those funds. Like you mentioned a few minutes ago, that the only payment to have resulted from the Act is Google's settlement with the Canadian government for 100 million Canadian dollars, adjusted for inflation on a yearly basis. Definitely this distribution mechanism, in my opinion, doesn't seem to be the right approach. It does not reward quality. And there is like definitely a big issue here between quality and quantity. The way that this distribution mechanism was handled was to grant similar compensation depending on the same number of journalists for different organizations. So they call it the full-time employee equivalent, which is a little bit weird because to me, we should reward in priority quality of the content. For example, quality investigative journalism, and not necessarily like just quantity. For example, if you have low quality content just to create sensational clickbaits, it doesn't make sense to reward the same amount for quality journalism.
Yeah.
So definitely, I would say that the distribution should take into account quality and not only quantity. And it should also take into account some sort of diversity elements to make sure that the smaller publishers who have less bargaining power, who have less lobbying force, should also be part of the picture.
Yeah, such an important point, and I'm glad you raised that, because if the public good function of some form of public subsidy, whether it's through these types of direct legislative approaches or whether it would be through tax credits, one should understand that there are certain things that the media does, like investigative journalism, that arguably are more in the public good than, let's say, publishing horoscopes and Wordle. And I think maybe this is what I'll end with you on, Maxime, is just the sheer complexity of all this, trying to define who and what a media organization is, something that was not unimportant for Google and Meta, especially Meta, in terms of now having to remove all these organizations from their platform. Then trying to figure out, or not, what types of media you're going to support, broadcast versus print, digital, local versus national. And then even within that, where is the value? Is it in investigative journalism? Is it in, covering local politics? So many of these things just seem to me to be incredibly hard problems to solve for. And we seem to be using, especially in C18, pretty blunt force kind of tools to approach these issues. Let's have you wrap up with some reflections on that.
No, that's a fantastic point. So definitely when you go to such complex legislation, you have to be careful about the meaning of each concept. And here you're touching upon a very important one. In the Act, the definition of news content is extremely general. And at the end of the day, the regulation assigns the responsibility to companies like Meta to determine what constitutes Canadian news, both conceptually and technically. And to me, it's a very dangerous practice because Meta's potential obligations to its users, both publishers and consumers like you and I, we want to be able users to post freely namely to develop methods like to remove the content that is potentially not news. But at the same time, we don't want to remove content that does infringe the regulation. So definitely to put the responsibility on US for-profit American companies to define what is Canadian news, what is not news, it's another issue, in my opinion, that if the government views news and legacy news publishers in particular as public good, it should not potentially put such a big responsibilities on for-profit American companies.
Well, Maxime Cohen, Scale AI Chair at McGill University, thank you so much for coming on Hub Dialogues today, sharing the results of this fascinating paper. We'll be sure to include a link in it in the show notes and in our show descriptions. Again, really appreciate your research, your openness to this conversation, and I urge everyone to dig into the paper, digest its thoughtful and considered approach to this complex piece of legislation. It points the way possibly to some important reforms, improvements, changes that could happen in the media landscape in the months and years to come. Thank you, and bye-bye.